decided to inaugurate a series of presentation of our young, talented, and brilliant, distinguished early career award recipients. Today is the first one, is Ilana's presentation on educational stratification and self-concept, a comparative study of women with Jewish versus non-Jewish upbringing. And we have Ilana and two respondents, Harriet Hartman and Paul Burstein, that I will present when their turn will come. I want to tell you that Ilana, as you well know, I'll introduce him very briefly. She has a PhD in sociology of education and Jewish studies from Stanford University. She's assistant professor of Jewish studies and sociology and the Fields-Royan Chair of Contemporary Jewish Life at the Stuart and Susan Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience at Tulane University. I think that one of the most outstanding characteristic of her research is that she takes a sociological approach to examine how people's religious upbringing, race, ethnicity, social class, and gender shape their life, especially their educational experiences. Today, in her presentation, we'll have the joy to see how structure, agency, society, and culture are dimensions that come together, how the singular or particular characteristic of a minority has a projections to other minorities and to society in general, and altogether how contemporary Jewry research has a place in the concept of social sciences. So without delaying our session, I will invite Ilana to present us her today's conference. Please, Ilana.
Thank you so much, Judit. Thank you all for taking time to come and listen to this talk. I'm so grateful to the ASSJ for this opportunity to present my work, and also for I'm very honored to be the inaugural recipient of the Early Career Award. So thank you all for being here. And Matt, congratulations on your award as well. And I look forward to hearing your talk in the coming months or whenever it is scheduled. And really, Judit, thank you so much for taking time to chair this and to organize this. And Harriet and hopefully Paul Burstein will join us as the respondents. My plan is to talk for about 30-ish minutes about a paper that I published. It was published in 2022. I want to spend some time just telling you the story behind the story of this paper, particularly for any early career folks on this call. I always find the story behind the articles to be quite interesting. How did they come about? These articles often take years to write, and we don't usually get to, unlike in a book where you read the acknowledgments and you learn sort of the background of how something came to be, you don't learn that in an article. And this paper had a story, so I wanted to share that story. And I think if people have questions and they want to put them in the chat, I'll try to look at it as I'm talking. But we will certainly have an opportunity afterwards for Q&A. So I put the link to this paper in the chat. It is an open access paper. There is no paywall, even if you are not in a higher education institution. So if you, hopefully you got it. I'll post it one more time because it looks like some people joined after I posted it. All right. And this is a paper that I started working on as a graduate student. And this paper sort of, the story begins, I was like second third-year graduate student at Stanford. I was working, my PhD is in sociology of education from the Stanford Graduate School of Education. And I was spending a lot of time with Lee Shulman, who many of you know, who was really a mentor of mine. And I was having a really hard time coming up with dissertation ideas. I had come to graduate school interested in kind of like the Hebrew school dropout phenomenon. I did my qualifying paper on that topic. I think it's in contemporary Jewry. It's called Foregrounding the Family. And I kind of was like, I don't really want this to be the focus of my dissertation. And I was just like really approaching, not like struggling to find something interesting. And so I was meeting with Lee Shulman on a regular basis in his office over a cup of coffee. And one day he mentioned that he was going to the offices of the Jim Joseph Foundation, which actually funds the Stanford doctoral program in education and Jewish studies, and that he was bringing together a bunch of people to give talks. This is probably like 2015. And he was going to be bringing in Tomas Jimenez, who was sort of a race and ethnicity, and then bringing in Chris Smith, who was just of religion, and of young people. And the goal of those people together is for people at the Jim Joseph Foundation to sort of learn about research outside of the Jewish community. And I said, wow, I'd love to be a full totally foreign to me. So I showed up at this meeting, religion at Notre Dame. I had never heard of him. He gets on the Zoom and he starts talking about this data set called the National Study of Youth and Religion, which I also had never heard about. And he happens to mention, he's like, yeah, we followed 3,000 teenagers from 2003 to 2013. It's longitudinal, there's quantitative data, there's qualitative data. And then he says, and by the way, there's an oversample of Jews, and we had hired a postdoc ever happened. And not I happen to know is in need of good data for a dissertation, have, of course, that even the room where you're telling this, told us about the NSYR, I'd love to have access to those data. And I have to really give such credit to all of both this paper and my entire dissertation, which really stemmed from this relationship that I developed with Chris Smith, because he and his team were incredibly generous about sharing all of their data. Their quantitative data are all publicly available. The interview data are also publicly available if you request it. It's really such an incredible treasure trove of data. And I'll go into how I use it in particular, but I want to sort of put it into your minds that this might be a data set that you might be interested in. The Jewish oversample, it's not huge. I think they have a total of 130 respondents in the survey data, and the oversample part is 90 people. I'll talk about some of the Jewish youth in the data set, but this oversample really gave me sort of the idea that maybe one of my dissertation, I did a multi-paper edition. I ended up having 5 papers, usually you have 3, whatever, long story of how I got to 5. But I was like, I want to have one of my papers be about Jews and something about educational stratification. And when I started working on this idea, and it's very, very nascent stages, which was just me literally just reading interviews with the young Jewish participants, people said to me things like, no real sociologist is going to take American Jews very seriously. They're a very high achieving, affluent group. You're really not going to get very far with this paper. It's never going to land in a top sociology journal. You're wasting your time. And I really, really was wrong. I really did. It was a mission of mine. I was like, I am determined how to make the case of America. And I knew it was possible because I had been walking around ASSJ, I think earlier that year, and you the book tables, and I Jewry's book, Summoned, which I was like, on display, had award from the sociology of, I don't know, the culture section. And I was like, okay, somebody has figured out how to get an award from the sociology from ASA based on this, right? The cover is so late Jewish, right? It's like a kind of like pay us. And I was like, I can do it, right? That was my goal. So I had this mission to get this article out how to make it interesting to a broader sociology journal. And when I started interviews with the Jewish participants, so boring. I grew up with, these were people who basically were born in the late 80s, or 90s, come of age in the early 2000s. And there was like really nothing interesting about them. And I was just kind of wallowing in the data. And then I decided I received a couple of grants, and I decided to hire some research assistants because I knew that there was going to be, first of all, like too much data for me to manage on my own, but also that I really love working collaboratively with people. I can't. And so I hired 2 research assistants, both of whom were not Jewish. They are now co-authors of the paper, Kaylee Matheny and Crystal Laria. And so they basically started reading interview transcripts, and they have interesting backgrounds. They both came with pretty Christian upbringings. And one of them grew up in sort of like the deep South. And the other one, I can't remember where she grew up, but they were like, wow, these women are so interesting. I was like, really? What is interesting about them? And to them, the Jewish women seemed like people they had never met. Like there was something distinctly different in the way that they imagined, they talked about their life and the way they imagined their careers and the way they imagined motherhood and the way they imagined higher education. And when my research assistants realized there was something interesting about them that I wasn't seeing, I was like, oh, maybe there's something there, like maybe there's something here that I haven't been seeing. And so originally this was a paper that wasn't focused on gender. It was really focused on the educational pathways of Jewish and non-Jewish men and women. And as I worked on the paper for like a couple of years, one of my advisors, Mitchell Stevens, he read a version of it, and he's like, you have some sort of gender angle here. And there's clearly a gender story that I wasn't seeing. And once he said it, I was like, oh, right, there's totally a gender story. Like the women are so much more interesting. He noticed that I kept referencing the women. And so then I was like, oh, this is a paper about gender, and I didn't even realize it. And at the time, I really didn't know much. I wasn't like really an expert in the gender literature. And I, as I mentioned, I love collaborating with people. And we had a new postdoc come to Stanford, Landon Schnabel. Some of you may know him. He was a doctoral student at Indiana University. He won like every award from the SSR and from the Association for the Study of Religion. Like he was like a big name person. And he came to Stanford as a postdoc, and I was like, I've got to meet this guy. So I called him before he started, and I was like, hey, you don't know who I am, but you win every award. And I'm happy to help you get settled. I told him all about Stanford. And when he got there, we went and had coffee. And I told him about this paper, and I knew he had done a lot of work on gender, and I was kind of stuck. And so I invited him, we had this great conversation. I invited him to be the 4th author on this paper. A lot of experience publishing in sociology, and I tell the story partly to say that it really took the right configuration of people to make this paper happen. And that although I'm the one presenting it and I'm the first author, it was really a collaborative effort. And I just want to give definitely a shout out to Kaylee and Crystal and Landon for being really amazing co-authors and collaborators on this paper. And also to Chris Smith and his team for making it possible. So I'm going to talk I'm not going to share my slides. They're kind of dense. I'm just going to talk about them, but if anybody wants them afterwards, I'm happy to share them. I want to talk about the motivation for this paper. I'll talk about the methods in more detail. I'm going to talk about what I think is the significance and contributions of this paper and, some of the potential limitations and future directions. I knew that to get this paper and to get the case of American Jews sort of interesting, make it interesting to broader sociologists, I had to figure out, like, what are American Jews an interesting case of, right? And I'm a sociologist of education by training, and so I wanted to intervene in a conversation about educational stratification. And I'm going to be talking to you guys about both the vertical and horizontal dimensions of educational stratification. So what do I mean by that? So vertical stratification means like how much education you get, right? High school diploma, college degree, master's degree, doctorate, right? Vertical. And then there's the horizontal stratification piece, which is like generally the quality of the higher education institution that you're at, which is often measured by its selectivity. And the reason we went down the educational stratification path is because we knew we had some sort of gender story, and the story of women in higher education is interesting. So over the past 3 decades, US women in the United States have doubled their college completion rates, and they are now surpassing men in in terms of their educational attainment. But there's a lot of variation amongst women. So college completion rates and the selectivity, both the horizontal and vertical stratification, varies among women, and it's influenced by structural factors like race and socioeconomic status, as well as cultural factors like religious subculture. So there was a paper that I had read that really influenced my thinking for this paper, and that is a paper by Jeremy Ecker, who's at Baylor University, and Lisa Pierce, who is at UNC, I think. And they had written a paper in Social Forces. It was also a mixed methods paper where they used, first they did a quantitative section and a qualitative section, and they really focused on conservative Protestant women. And they talked about how conservative Protestant women undermatch in the college selection process, meaning that they go to less selective institutions than we would potentially expect them to. And that paper really sat with me for a long time and served as a model for me, because I was like, okay, well, if conservative Protestant women are having these experiences in higher education, what might it look like for for Jewish women? And so in this article, we were really interested in investigating women's educational pathways from a cultural and sociological perspective. And we wanted to emphasize how religious subculture shapes habitus, which I'll talk about, and how it contributes to the stratification of higher education by gender and by religion, right? Because sociologists of higher ed, or sociologists of education and stratification, knew that higher ed is stratified by gender, and we wanted to bring in this religious subculture angle. Because despite its historical consideration as a core stratification factor, religious subculture is seldom discussed in current research on the dimensions of women's post-secondary education. Just for some historical context, religion was once a very central variable in education stratification studies, but its importance has really diminished in recent research, which has largely focused on the educational attainment, as I mentioned, of the conservative Protestant communities. So one of the goals of our paper was we wanted to develop some sort of broader theory that includes religious subculture as a stratification mechanism, particularly for understanding variations in educational outcomes among women. But there's this challenge in generating a theory about how gender and religious subculture operates, because there's a pretty unclear link between religious subculture and educational processes. In the current research, we found that many studies focus on an individual's adult religious affiliation. And actually, I think Ariella Kesar, you're on this call, and I think you're cited a fair amount in this paper because you've done some of that work looking at adult religious affiliation and how it is associated with educational outcomes. But when we just focus on the individual's adult religious affiliation, or we attribute educational differences to ethno-religious heritage, without sort of explaining the mechanisms, we're overlooking how upbringing and socialization into a religious subculture might matter. We were also really thinking about the literature on model minorities like Jews and Asians, which often attributes high educational attainment to being Jewish or being Asian without understanding the underlying social and cultural mechanisms that end up perpetuating this myth of like, oh, there's a genetic predisposition or an oversimplification of these complex sociocultural dynamics, and where people just say like, well, Jews do well in school because they just value education more. But really what that means often is like, oh, well, you know, Black people don't do well in education because they don't value education. And we just like, I just don't believe that that is the case. I think that there's other things besides just valuing something that enables Jews and Asians to be educationally successful. And another piece of work that was very influential is the Asian American Achievement Paradox, which offers, by the way, a pretty similar argument to us in that Asian American, especially the 1.5 generation, has particular, there are social and psychological processes that help, facilitate the educational advancement of Asians, and doesn't reify this kind of like genetic predisposition or the idea that Asians just value education. Was to really sort of move away from ascribed characteristics like ethno-religious heritage or race. We wanted to try to develop some better explanatory mechanisms and really wanted to think about structural and cultural and social psychological processes. And this paper, in this paper, we investigate how girls raised by Jewish parents benefit from structural and cultural and social psychological processes that support their educational advancement. And the reason we were interested in, we sort of described in the article that we focus on Jews because despite being one of the most highly educated groups in the United States, the educational advantage of Jews cannot be solely attributed to high socioeconomic status or cultural bias in favor of schooling. In writing our article, we leaned pretty heavily on Pierre Bourdieu and his concept of habitus. So Bourdieu's notion of habitus, for those of you who have studied it, encompasses broadly the habits of mind, actions, and dispositions, and these evaluative orientations that largely operate outside of our consciousness. And our habitus is shaped by our life experiences, and it predisposes us as individuals to reproduce those experiences. So the literature on habitus, which is very popular amongst stratification scholars, suggests that disparities in post-secondary outcomes partly arise from varying habitus developed within family contexts, and that the one's habitus influences their early aspirations, and that these early aspirational differences and their subsequent views on education influence their college planning and their college choices. Actually, I am going to share one slide to help you guys, if you're looking at the screen, just visualize what I'm talking about. This was our concept framework. This is how we thought about things. Hold on one sec. Oh, wait, now you can't see my, that's a tricky thing. Okay. You know what? If you want to see the actual figure, feel free to click the link on the paper. It's figure 1, but I realize I need my notes in order to be able to talk about it. Okay. So apologies, I just got myself off track. So our theory was that one's habitus is not just influenced by socioeconomic status, that it is also influenced by a religious subculture, that a religious subculture shapes the habitus that children acquire, and that there are shared ideas and values, experiences and behaviors and symbols that are transmitted intergenerationally within religious and ethno-religious groups. And we emphasize that religious cultures are influenced both by theology, but also by historical events and demographic patterns, political concerns, and all of these things collectively shape the values and behaviors beyond just religious belief. We, in the paper, talk about the central role of schooling and education in Jewish subculture, which is historically organized around Torah study, and which, you know, other people have written about this, how it led to early literacy and skilled occupations as societal structures evolved. And we talked about how education is now integral to Jewish religious subculture, and that it possibly shapes, our theory was that it shapes children's views on advanced degrees and professional careers as essential components of their identities. And we talked about how religious subcultures socialize children into gender ideologies. And this part is really important. There's something very unique about American Judaism in that it is actually the most gender egalitarian religion. And so we theorize that there's something about the gender egalitarianism of being brought up in a American Jewish home that was influencing how girls especially were imagining their career and education and family choices. We thought that you know, in homes, in Jewish homes, girls, you know, parents were telling both their boys as well as their girls that they can be anything that they want to be, and that the girls had models for that. Whereas I know from other research on Christians and even people who are not religious in America, that there are much more traditional gender norms still taught, and that girls are often taught, like, your job is to be a mother and to have like a more private realm of the home, and that the man's role is, you know, to go out and be the primary breadwinner and to have a more public role. And so there was something about the gender egalitarianism of Jewish life that we thought was important in this story. And all of this, we figured, or we theorized, works together to shape what we call, or what other people have called, self-concept development. So self-concept is basically a sort of your sense of self. And we theorize that girls growing up in Jewish homes had a self-concept where they're, and that in order to gain self-concept congruence, basically to make themselves sort of fit into the models available in their community, that higher education and a sort of like professional career was an important part of attaining self-concept congruence. And so I'll just share this visual now that I've talked through it. So here you can see there's religious subculture, including views of gender egalitarianism, that operates together with social class, which other people have already documented the role of social class. All of that shapes family socialization and upbringing. That shapes your system, your habitus, your system of dispositions. That shapes your self-concept, your perceptions and beliefs about yourself. And all of that facilitates your aspirations for higher education. This is obviously a very simplistic figure. It's very linear. We know that the real world is much messier, but we also know that sociologists love figures, and apparently this one worked to help people sort of grasp what we were talking about. Really having some. There you go. Here's the figure. There you go. Subculture. Social class feeds into family socialization for higher education. All right, hopefully you guys got the gist of that. So how were we going to figure this out? Oh, wait, let me talk about how we justified the case of American Jews to the sociology audience. So we said, we thought that American Jews were an interesting test case for how this quest for self-concept congruence could stratify higher education by religious subculture and gender. We talked about how Jews have had an educational advantage, but it's merely due to their higher socioeconomic status. And we said we needed to look beyond cross-sectional surveys to understand the underlying mechanisms. In the paper, we talk about the importance of social networks and transmitting educational advantages, with Jewish adolescents often embedded in networks that value high and professors. And we had two hypotheses going into the paper. We theorized that adolescents with at least one Jewish parent likely to earn a bachelor and would be more likely to attend a more selective college. And our second set of hypotheses, educational advantage was going to be even greater for adolescents with two Jewish parents due to a more pronounced Jewish upbringing and exposure to professionals within their family networks. And in the paper, you see that we distinguish between children with two JPs, two Jewish parents, versus kids with one Jewish and often met one non-Jewish parent, right? Because we were developing a theory of socialization, we wanted to see sort of like how thick was your Jewish socialization and how thick was your exposure to the stories, the sort of role models in the Jewish community. We also theorized that the impact of Jewish upbringing, that being raised in the sort of Jewish milieu, would be stronger among women, as I mentioned, which we attributed to Jewish support for gender egalitarianism, which we thought would influence girls' self-concepts and aspirations for their careers and education differently than boys. I think those are the main points. Okay, so I will share my slide about our, methods. One second. Okay, so I mentioned we used data from the National Study of Youth and Religion. So this is a 4-wave multi-method longitudinal study. It started in 2002 to 2003 with adolescents who were 13 to 17 years old, 13 to 17. And this is a nationally representative sample of over 3,200 adolescents and the oversample of 80 Jews. They did this as a phone survey. And what was really important for us, because we were thinking about the role of parents, is that in the first wave, they also surveyed one parent in the household. And so we had perspective of the teens for 4 years, but we also had a bunch of variables from the parents that allowed us to make an argument about upbringing that maybe we wouldn't have been able to make if we only had the child level data. The NSYR team also then followed up with semi-structured interviews over the course of the 10-year period of the study with a subset of the participants. And all of this was longitudinal, right? They surveyed the kids in 2005, 2008, and 2013, and they also did the interviews repeatedly over that time. This project was like many, many millions of dollars. One of the unique things that we were able to do that I think helped us land in the ASR, and I think like helped us overcome some of the prior challenges, is that there's generally, if you do longitudinal work, there's an attrition problem in that people who drop out of your study along the way is a random attrition. It's mostly people who are poorer, more likely to be people of color. There are people who are more likely to not end up in higher education, are the people who are most likely to attrit. And I, with an idea of one of my mentors from Stanford, Eric Bettinger, I was able to get the data linked to the National Student Clearinghouse. So let me explain what that is in case it is helpful for any of you in your research. The National Student Clearinghouse basically houses all the higher education data for like 95% of people enrolled in higher education institutions in the United States. And so like, you know, for any of you, there's a record in there. So for myself, you know, there's a record in there that says like, Ilana, you know, started college in whatever, 99 and did X number of semesters at Emory University. She graduated with this degree, then she went and got a master's here, and then she got a PhD here. And it has a semester by semester level accounting of every institution I've ever been enrolled in and every degree I've ever received. And so I really wanted to have the data linked because the National Study of Youth and Religion, you know, it had higher education outcomes, but they were limited for all sorts of reasons, including the attrition problem. So I had developed a very, very good relationship with the NSYR team by this point. because they had to actually make the request, the linking to happen. They had to give over the real names, as well as their, which I obviously was not able to see. I paid for the matching, which cost like a couple $1,000, but they actually did all the work, and then they sent me back a file that had all the de-identified information. Again, I tell the story to both NSYR and also get people thinking, what does it take? And it takes creativity, and it takes really for being really amazing partners. And so combining the survey data with the interview data with the parent data and the national study of or the National Student Clearinghouse allowed for this in-depth examination of how a religious educational outcomes over a 10-year period. So as opposed to looking retroactively, right, we were able to follow kids from adolescence into adulthood to actually see how their aspirations sort of play out over the course of their lives. And I think this was, at the time, was a very unique and comprehensive study, and I think that helped it land in ASR as I've sort of thought about it over the years. Let me share some of the key findings. I'll share a slide for this one too, just so that I'm not going to share all the figures, but if you're interested, I have, feel free to ask me about any of the specific figures. But there are 5 key findings in this paper, and they mostly align with our hypothesis. Jewish by at least one Jewish parent have a higher likelihood of completing a 4-year college degree, which cases the role of religious upbringing over merely adult religious affiliation. 2, higher selectivity in college attendance. So Jewish upbringing correlates with attending more selective colleges. So there's both the vertical and the horizontal stratification, marking this finding that Jewish individuals not only pursue higher education at higher rates, which, you don't need my study to tell you that, but that they are also gaining entry into more highly selective institutions. We can, in the Q&A, of course, discuss whether we think this pattern will continue to hold, particularly in light of what's happening on elite college campuses after October 7th. But this is a study, obviously, that you have to think about the time period in which this was happening. These were American Jews entering colleges in the 2000s, let's say 5 to 8 period. Our third finding was the role of a primarily versus partially Jewish upbringing. Remember, with pretty small sample sizes, we were able to find statistically significant differences that showed that Jewish achieve better educational outcomes than those with Jewish and non-Jewish parent, which we call a partially Jewish upbringing. And this to us suggests the importance of the extent of one's religious exposure. We also found that girls outperform boys in educational attainment. In shift from previous trends, girls raised by Jewish parents now surpass their male counterparts in educational attainment, which reflects both gender and cohort changes. Happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but yeah, aligning and following the trends of general American men, Jewish men are also their rates of educational attainment are dropping pretty significantly, I would say. And then we found this in the qualitative data, the self-concept and career goals among Jewish women, Jewish girls. So girls with Jewish upbringings articulate a self-concept that is tied to elite career aspirations and the importance of higher education for achieving those goals, which was very different from the narratives of the non-Jewish girls who prioritize motherhood and who view college selectivity as less critical for their self-concept congruence. Unlike conservative Protestant views where men and women diverge in their perspectives on the purpose of college, both men and women raised in Jewish households receive similar messages about the value of college, but it seems like the girls raised in Jewish homes really sort of take that to the next level in which it translates to where they want to go. See that fitting into their career trajectories. Just one quote with you. I'm having a hard time advancing my slides. So here is just one like tiny snippet. This is a girl, oops. Okay, slides do not want to advance. Nope. You'd think all these years of Zoom, I wouldn't have these challenges, but alas. So this is a girl named Leia. This is an excerpt of her interview from the age of 14, again at the age of, and so she's asked at age 14. So if you have like answering these questions, what are your future educational plans? And she says, I want to go to college and graduate school. And they say, what do you want to study? She says, I want to study either business or law, whichever one, because I want to be in sports management. And some people study business and some people study law because there are both aspects of it. And I don't know which one I want to do yet. And then she's asked, do you think you want to go to graduate school as well? Yes. What kind of degree do you think you want? And she says, I don't think I want to do business or law in undergrad. I think I want to do it in graduate school and do something else in undergrad. And so as a 14-year-old, she has like an interestingly sophisticated view of what sort of is the order of higher education. And she even already has ideas in her mind about what she wants to do and how she's going to fit that in together. And then at age 20, she's asked, how would you describe yourself when it comes to the question of your purpose in life? She says, very clear. I've never felt lost. I think I've always known what I actually wanted to do with my life. And the person says, what's that? And she says, I want to work in sports. And I've known since I was 8 that I wanted to do this and I loved it. And then I realized it was a career and I was like, oh. And so we use this quote to both like in the paper to showcase how both articulate young Jewish women were about their career aspirations. And then we, in the paper itself, highlight how, or contrast with how inarticulate the views were of girls from the non-Jewish sample who were of a similar socioeconomic status, I should mention, right? We only matched interviews between girls of similar social class groups. It wasn't that we were comparing like, you know, upper class Jewish women with like, you know, class or at the upper quarter of the socioeconomic status distribution, because we wanted to sort of get as close as possible to comparing apples to apples. And their views of their lives and higher education and their careers was very distinctly different. I will say that some of the, let me outline just a few of like the contributions and the limitations. So I want to be clear that this was a paper mostly about non-Orthodox Jewish women. The results primarily reflect the educational patterns of non-Orthodox Jewish women who constitute the majority of the sample of the NSYR. And I acknowledge that the outcomes might be different if we were to focus on, you know, women Orthodox homes, particularly in Haredi homes. My theory is if we talk to girls in modern Orthodox homes, they wouldn't really sound all that different these days. But I think because I know that educational attainment trends amongst the modern Orthodox are the same as amongst conservative and Reform Jews, but it's really amongst the ultra-Orthodox that we might expect to see a difference. And what we hope this paper does is call attention for or advocates for stratification scholars to consider religious subculture as a significant factor in educational stratification. And we're aiming to shift the discourse, both the academic and popular discourse, away from saying, oh, well, people just value education, or, oh, well, there's just like this genetic predisposition, towards a more nuanced understanding of how religious upbringing operates. And we want to challenge the notion that there are certain religious groups that are inherently predisposed to educational success, We're arguing in the paper that Jews' high educational attainment is the result of, social, historical, cultural, and psychological factors as opposed to genetic dispositions. In the paper, we talk about like one girl who actually was adopted and I think from China and raised in a Jewish school. And, she sounds just like or very similar to the other Jewish girls who were, quote unquote, born Jewish. So we're really trying to move the discourse away from this like inherited disposition to an acquired socialized disposition. And another intervention is that we wanted to get thinking about how one upbringing influences their self-concept and beliefs about gender education and how that contributes to aspirations for elite education and careers, both through observing adult role models and sort of being part of a milieu that shares a sort of kind of a historical legacy of educational success. And then we also really warn in the paper against making value judgments about different habitus. And we want to challenge the notion that educational success stems from just adopting the right cultural values, meaning like people will say with the model minorities, oh, well, if just, Hispanic or Black people would just do things the right way, like the Jews and the Asians, right, they would do better. And we really try to clear of that kind of or prescriptive or judge as one of the reasons I'm able to make it is, yes, you could value education, but they also had a lot of other factors sort of working that enabled them to actually be successful. And combined with structural factors enabled educational success for Jews in a way that it hasn't enabled it for Black Americans. And we also wanted to support the idea that success can have different meanings amongst different cultural and religious contexts, and that what it constitutes a good education or a successful life varies significantly amongst religious groups. So, in liberal American Jewish circles, yes, a good life is often equated with like you get the right education, you have the right career, but we wanted to be careful about saying like that is not how all cultural and religious groups in America prioritize things, and that was totally fine. A few final points. We really wanted to encourage future studies to explore the influence of religious subculture and self-concept on both the vertical and horizontal stratification. And we wanted to really, at the end of the day, urge scholars to reconsider religion as a crucial factor in educational and social stratification research, given its profound impact on shaping educational trajectories and societal roles. If I were writing this paper for like a Jewish studies audience, my, the way in which I would have the key contributions would have been different, but because I was writing for a broad sociological audience, this is how they sort of shaped up. So I'm gonna stop talking, and I'm gonna pass it over to Harriet, whose work I also cite heavily in the paper, and I look forward to your remarks. Thanks all for listening.
Okay, Harriet. So it was a direct connection. So let me, to those of you who don't know her, she's a professor emeritus at Rowan University and a part-time faculty of Hadassah Academic College in Jerusalem, Israel. She has published and co-authored several books. She's currently, just to be short, she has received several awards. She currently is the editor-in-chief of our journal, Contemporary Jewry. And it's not a random coincidence that that Ilana has asked Harriet to present her comments, and I would afterwards try to see how both your work are related precisely to enrich the concept of habitus. I think that on this we have gained a lot since Bourdieu first formulated in this sense. So Harriet, please, your comments.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't say. Ilana was great, really. I find it very generous, this sharing of an experience, what precedes the work and what looks after to new generations. So sorry, Harriet, here you are.
Okay, I just also wanted to say, now I understand we gave you, so like, I enjoyed going through the article and most of it is, now we're with lots of where we do out of this, but I do have a few comments on the paper presentation, and I thought it's really helpful to know how people get to these great papers and get something on geology published in ASR. That's really unusual, and it's really interesting, but also being willing to take advantage of opportunities was really a part of this. And I think it characterizes your approach to doing research and being in the right place at the right time. And I think we're all benefiting from it. So thank you for your work and for your presentation. I'm just going to say one thing, that many years before you wrote about habitus, paper for Debbie Kaufman's special inquiry Jewry on narrative and professional and personal identity. And I called it Reflections on My Jewish Habitus. I feel like I was forecasting something that you did. But there I go over how me being Jewish and the ways that I was Jewish influenced the way that I became a researcher in Jewish studies. So I feel like it fits in really nicely. I pushed you to show your figure because I have a comment on your figure. I think it's much more complicated than what the figure shows. And I tried, I spent over half an hour trying to do this. I don't know, any of you who have published figures, I think a lot of time is spent on the artwork of that. I couldn't do that now. I had like about half an hour. I tried. I want to share it with you just so I can explain some of my points. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, I can see it, Harriet.
Okay, good. Okay, so there's social class and religion. I more or less kept that the same. But social class affects family socialization. Social class also affects habitus. Religion affects habitus. Religion affects family socialization. And there's something really missing. You don't have gender there. And gender itself, how you do gender is affected by your family socialization and your religion. And how you do what your habitus is affected by your gender. And so, and also what you do in bringing that to a self-concept is affected by gender and family socialization and habitus and aspirations. So gender doesn't go away. Gender is directly affecting aspirations. Habitus doesn't go away. It's directly affecting aspirations, as well as affecting, as well as the ways that you have it. And so this would become a path analysis, and it would be harder for everybody to understand. And there would be all sorts of little statistics that people don't know what to do with, and they would just read what you did. And yours is much simpler, but it's really the reality is much more complicated. And that was one comment. And I think that we do have structural analysis that allows you to build a path model which more accurately reflects what reality is. And I always tend to complicate things. So I appreciate that you didn't in your article because everybody can grasp it, but it's not completely accurate. The only thing that screen share. Okay. Done next. And one of them is how did, at the elite universities, Jews are a minority. So who are those people that are in the elite universities and why did they want to get there? You compare the Jewish and the non-Jewish elite universities and figure out what's the difference between them. I mean, maybe there's a subset of non-Jewish students who are just like the Jewish students, and that's why they're in prestigious universities, or maybe not. But to expect from your why there would be any non-Jewish women in prestigious universities. And we know that, so what about them? That family or career, they're looking at different families. So I think the data of the youth in religion, I think they have number of siblings or number of children in family, and it would be really important to look at it, just like you looked at religiosity, to look at what does that family mean and what influence does that have on their aspirations for higher education. Another thing that I don't think they do have, but I think in addition to their religiosity would be other sources of socialization, so that summer camps and bar and bat mitzvah and other things that contributed to their Jewish identity probably affect their self-concept and their aspirations. I don't know what data we have to test that, but it would be really good to have it in there. I mean, usually the studies that have more measures of Jewish identity don't have self-concept, and they don't have half of the things iterations. So in the NJPS 1990, there were some of these variables, and that we could put into a book, but it wasn't there in 2000, and it wasn't there in the Pew studies. So I don't know where we can get that data, but I think it would be important. I whether this holds for non-American Jewish habitus, because I don't think it works in Israel, but that's just an anecdotal kind of thing. I think it's a very different kind of dynamic. Who gets to the major university, who gets to the colleges? I think there are other things at play. They go to college later, they're working, they have families. I think that has more to do with where they want than their aspirations. And I don't even know how they form aspirations, whether they have aspirations in high school. I want to get into Hebrew University, and then they wind up at a college so they didn't get in. I mean, I really don't know. But I think it would be very interesting to know whether this is American Jewish culture or it's Jewish. Another thing that you mentioned you mentioned in your paper the difference between the denominations, but this is definitely not working for the Orthodox, especially the ultra-Orthodox, and they're a minority of American Jews. But they're also, we wrote a paper where we said more Jewish, less Jewish, like who's Jewish? Who has more of Jewish identity? Who has more? So is this a Jewish thing or it's American Jewish culture? And American Jewish culture may be made up of many more things that are American than Jewish. There are things like highbrow culture. They're taken to concerts. They're taken to operas. They go to book clubs. There's a whole set of regular culture that American Jews do that makes that. I don't know if it's partly social class, but you controlled for social class. So it's not just social class, but it may be the interaction between Jewishness and social class that makes this a special subculture. And maybe you have some of that data, I don't know. But I think it's something that we should be studying. What is this American Jewish identity and how Jewish is it? How much is it an interaction with other kinds of activities? And I'm looking at Sergio and how he always thought the thing that unites American Jews is Thanksgiving. It could be Thanksgiving, it could be two cars, it could be, it could be a lot of things that are not particularly Jewish, but they're American, and it's the interaction between American and Jewish identity, which is interesting. So anybody who has graduate students, I guess I have lots of ideas for them. I don't think I'm going to entertain, I'm not going to engage in these researches, but maybe you will. And that's why we have Young Career Awards. But I think that it's really great what you did and shows how much can be done with data. And I hope some of these ideas can be explored. That's it.
Well, thank you very much, Harriet. Really, thank you. And after we listen to Paul's comments, then I would like to refer exactly to this elaboration where habitus has to do with an individual and a collective dimension, and how then education and family and other social structures allows us to see and to move away from probably Bourdieu's heavy weight on the structures and losing this perspective that habitus for a group is not homogeneous, how it is individually elaborated. So thank you very much. And now, Paul, you are with us and you're welcome. And I would like to introduce Paul Burstein. Is a professor in the graduate school and professor of sociology. Samuel and Althea Strom, chair in Jewish studies, and adjunct professor of political science emeritus. His research has focused on politics, social movement, social stratification, research method, and the American Jewish community. So Paul, be welcome, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to have this opportunity and to see Ilana and also Harriet as well as everybody else. This is a wonderful article, and I was one of the people who said, well, you'll never get an article like this in a major journal because they won't take articles about Jews, and was just delighted to see this, and I hope there will be many. But what makes the article especially wonderful for me, I think, besides the subject matter, is that it's the combination of being especially audacious and also at the same time very cautious. And this is a rare combination, I think. What makes it audacious is, first of all, I mean, the general idea of trying to get something on Jews in the American Sociological Review. But there are a number of things that are very innovative about it and very difficult to accomplish, comparing Jews and non-Jews in this way, focusing on what I might call culture, although that's not the term that's usually used, trying to go beyond the usual explanatory kinds of explanations we have for Jewish educational accomplishment, Jewish women's educational accomplishment, in ways that are very, very creative. And it's not easy to do that, and it's especially not easy to do that the way this is being, the way this article was done, because sometimes when people are very bold, they sort of skimp on the details. And that's not the case here. I mean, the amount of care that had to go into looking into the various data sets and combining them in such a very, very careful way. I mean, that's very rare in my experience for quite a few years now, looking at sociology and what's in the ASR in general. The degree of concern for data quality, concerns about limits in data, and all of that kind of thing just does not play nearly an important enough role, I think, in an awful lot of what's published, but it does here. So what you have are very audacious ideas backed up by data to the greatest extent that's humanly possible under the circumstances. It's very hard to pull that off, and I'm very glad to see that. Now, you know, the thing about getting something into ASR, there are ways in which there's always an element of luck, no matter how good the article might be from the point of view of authors and readers and everybody else. And one way, one possible point here where it could very easily, the paper could have been rejected, has to do with a small number of interviews. Okay, and I mean, you know that and you say it, it's not like it's a secret or anything. The in-depth interviews play a tremendously important role here. And there are very few of them. And you're very limited because of the what you could, anyway, it's just very limited. It's a very small amount of data. And to put that together with the survey data is really something. And I'm just tremendously glad that people were willing to see that for what it was, for what it's worth. Now, I had a question about Jewishness in all of this. The paper is supposed to be about, you know, there not being some magic that explains why Jews do well, or of course it's culture going back hundreds of years or something like that. There's an effort to look at mechanism. And of course, that is, as Ilana says, a critical contribution here, and it absolutely is. There's something in the data that could get at Jewishness a bit more. And it's religiosity. Okay, I mean, Ilana, you say that you've got a measure of religiosity for all of the respondents, and it would make sense to take that seriously so you're interested in what's going on Jewishly. And you know, you do take it into account, it's in the regression equations and so on. You don't talk about it very much. And I can imagine there being complications because you'd have to interact religiosity with what religion and all of that kind of stuff. But the actual measures raise for me an interesting question, because the measure of religiosity is what you call, it's a composite constructed from the adolescent's frequency of religious service attendance, how often the adolescent prays alone, how important religion is in the adolescent's daily life, and how close the adolescent feels to God. Now, when we're just doing studies of Jews by themselves, and you want to know, well, how do you measure religiosity? Those are not the questions we tend to ask, okay? We're doing surveys of American Jews, it tends to be, you know, do you light candles on Shabbat, and do you have a Passover Seder, and all things that are more distinctively Jewish. And of course, since the survey was supposed to be of a very wide sample of adolescents, you're not going to get that kind of question in there. But I wind up wondering how much it matters that there's this very, very generic way of measuring religiosity, and it's not what we would do if we were just studying Jews. Because on the one hand, you want to compare Jews to other people, and you have to have the same questions being asked of everybody on the one hand. On the other hand, these standard questions sort of diminish the particularity of the Jewish experience or the Jewish adolescent experience. You'd want to be able to take into account something, I mean, hypothetically, you'd want to be able to take into account something specifically Jewish about what's going on in these homes with one or two Jewish parents. And it's not really possible to do that with this data set. Well, you could do it, obviously. I don't know exactly what you would find if you did that, looked at that interaction. But for me, it raises the question about how difficult it might be to compare members of different religious groups if the religions are different in fundamental ways, so that religiosity means different things for different. Now, I don't know exactly how you would pursue that, but with a focus on culture, it would seem to me to be a very, very important thing to do. So that's another way of saying that there's a tremendous number of possible follow-ups to this, some of them feasible in the short term and others much more difficult. But there's an awful lot to build on here. And I would have a question as I finish up here, which is what kind of feedback have you been getting from other people about this? Do you get the sense that that people are really paying attention to it, really noticing it in a way that's likely to get what you want, which is other people being so enticed by this that they start to imagine their own research projects? So congratulations on a great article. I just love it.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Well, I think that we would now turn to some of the question and interventions, right? But I promise to say that what I found in your work, Harriet, and in work we all, that's a private joke, right? No, I think that it's very important, this idea of the collective that has communal disposition in the lifestyle, and so they have shared orientation, and this doesn't necessarily implies a homogeneous corpus. This is very important. So when you bring all the differences, trends in religion, etc., this brings a more complex and interesting picture, right? So because you bring inside the divergent interpretations, the difference in religious beliefs and practice, the forms of organization and differential access to structure the social, economic, but also to the intellectual capital, right, of the Jewish and of the American dimension that bring together. And to my understanding, this is a more undetermined approach or understanding of the praxis of social actors that Bourdieu sometimes underscores, right? Of course, there is one question that I would like to pose, which is that the individual habitus indeed contains the collective habitus. And the individual habitus is the singular composition of different collective strata to what you refer, what is Jewish, what is American, right? And the latter is the condensation of multiple individual ones. So here you have a very rich panorama, right, that invites to further continue with your research. But before you probably would like to answer, may we open for some remarks or questions that our colleagues would like to contribute, right? So to let us know, right, I first need to see exactly if you are unmuted, And this we have to ask from Ellie. I don't think I can.
Everyone can unmute their.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So it's individual. Thank you. So please, we have the first. It's yours, right? Please. It's the only hand I see raised. Please. You have to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm Davida Charney, and thank you so much for such a fascinating talk and study. And I'm interested to hear your answers to the comments from the other respondents. My question kind of builds on those because it's a suggestion for other things that you might be able to get out of the data that get at Jewish religiosity. And my observation that is that partly this particular cohort comes at a time when a nice distance after both the conservative movement and the reform movement began to allow women to have bat mitzvahs. And I know that's in the title of your talk, but of your paper, but I haven't read that. And what I'm interested in is not about the bat mitzvahs of the girls themselves, but of their mothers. Because I was in the generation when bat mitzvah first began in the conservative movement. And if in the interviews, it would be possible, the interviews with the parents, it would be possible to tell whether the mothers had bat mitzvahs. That might be one way to get at it. But another way to get at it could be through the birth date of the mothers, if that data is available, because that could be an approximation for whether it would have been possible, whether they were alive during the period when it was more of an expectation for their mothers that they would have had such a, a Jewish education. Because I've taught a lot of adult education in synagogues, and we're still at the time when in the parental cohort, the brothers got Jewish education, but not the women. And possibly a corresponding way to take a look at the non-Jewish data would be to take a look at the birth dates of the mothers relative to Vatican II, which was 63. I mean, it's not an exact match, but that might, at least among the Catholic cohort, might provide an interesting breakwater. Thank you so much.
Is there any other intervention, observation, remarks? So please, Ilana, it's your turn. We would like to listen what you have to.
Sure. Thank you so much for all the comments. And very distinctly remember, Paul, you and I can't remember what year it was, 2017, 2018. It was when ASA was in Philadelphia. We got together over Chinese food because Paul in 2007 had written an article kind of synthesizing the literature on where are we at with understanding Jews and educational attainment. That was very, I mean, I stand on the shoulders of giants in writing this article, and that article was very, very important. And so, yeah, and I do remember you being skeptical, and I was motivated extra hard to to get this article published in a way that was interesting to other people. So, Harriet, I do think this is a uniquely American Jewish story. I would not expect this in Israel, and I wouldn't expect this, I don't think this pattern is going to hold. I think we were in a sort of uniquely Jewish, in a unique moment where sort of the stories of Jews making it in America were infiltrating the, conversations with grandparents and bar mitzvah talk and all that. And I think as this generation of kids is growing up and they don't hear those stories, they're, I think that there's a few reasons why Jews are going to lose their sort of hold on the educational ladder. But I think if I did the study in 20 years, I don't think I would see the same thing. And there is something uniquely American about about it, and it's hard to totally like place what that is. I wish I could have also I could be an ethnographer in the early 2000s, sitting in the dining room, at the dining room tables of these people, like listening to their conversations to really understand the mechanisms by which the sort of like idea of the self-concept, how the self-concept is developed, but you know, can't quite do that. Paul, I think for sure, the NSYR religion variable is a very Protestant notion of religiosity. Absolutely, 100%. And so we tried like all sorts of different ways to really engage with the idea of religion. These, the Jewish kids in this sample, they didn't talk about sort of Jewish engagement all that much. They talked about going to Hebrew school. And one of the sort of most interesting ways in which it came up, and we talk about this in the qualitative section, is they would say like, I love being Jewish because in Hebrew school, they really teach me that you're supposed to push back on ideas, be open-minded, be really critical of things. And there's the Jewish women, one of the things that is distinctly different about them than the non-Jewish women is they're very open to new experiences. They're very they're not risk averse, they're bold, and part of like wanting to go to college is like they're not scared to go away to a far place and to try something that's uncomfortable. Whereas amongst the non-Jewish sample, there was a much they weren't as open-minded, they were more sort of seeking social safety, they wanted to stay closer to home. And you know, I don't know how much of that is a connection between growing up and being told, like in Hebrew school, you know, it's good to question things, even religion. But that was one of the unique ways in which Jewishness came up specifically. Oh, Harriet, you had mentioned something about like that this is both about serendipity, but also being able to see opportunities. I want to give a plug for a book that I have forthcoming with Princeton University Press. That is actually, it's called The Entrepreneurial Scholar, and it is in their Skills for Scholars series. And it is kind of in the genre of like self-help for grad students and academics. But I talk about, it's based on interviews, but a little bit based on my own personal experience. And one of the things I talk about is like the importance of being able to not just like think of things in terms of luck, but being able to recognize opportunities, to being that entrepreneurial people are alert, have an alertness for opportunity and are able to sort of see opportunities where other people aren't. And I do think this project is a testament to being able to recognize opportunities, a little bit being in the right place at the right time, but also recognizing like when Chris Smith sort of made that comment, really being able to figure out what to do with his comment and offer of sharing the data. You know, where will Jews go from here? Harriet, you asked, like, I don't know. I mean, partly I think like maybe they'll all just, I mean, Tulane already has a lot of Jewish students, but maybe they'll come to like the Emorys, the Tulanes, the sort of like what I call the, you know, like you wanted to go to an Ivy, but you couldn't, so you came here schools. You know, it's, but student choices around colleges are so interesting. Like I was talking to a prospective student who was applying to Tulane, and I was like, well, and she's really interested in Jewish studies. I was like, and this is pre-October 7th. I was like, are you considering Brandeis? And she's like, no, I heard they're like really, like some one comment about them being really anti-Semitic. I was like, Brandeis? And then she's like, yeah, I'm not applying because of that. And it was like this one anecdote that she heard that was like totally changing, you know, influencing her choice of colleges. I was like, you might want to reconsider, like that would probably be a really good place for you. So she was like, oh, really? Okay. So I don't know how people, I mean, what goes into people's decision-making factors. She is coming actually to Tulane. So, but I don't know sort of the role of parents now in a post-October 7th moment, how much they're going to be grappling with like, yes, part of being Jewish in America means like going to a really good school. And I also don't want you on this campus. I have no idea how parents are thinking about those choices. If any of you have college kids, college age kids, I'd be curious. The comment about like checking to see in the data about the mom's bat mitzvah, so interesting. I definitely don't have that level of detail. It's an interesting sort of thought experiment. You're probably right. And again, it's this particular cohort of women who grew up in the feminist movement and who probably heard stories of their mothers like and grandmothers talking about the importance of women going out and sort of like making it in the world, and maybe in a way that my kids won't hear as much because it's more commonplace. I don't know. And then there was a comment about, oh, what kind of reactions have I gotten to this paper? Paul, you asked this question. Yeah, it's interesting. So it got an insane amount of publicity in the popular sort of press. It was Tulane had released a press release, and it ended up being like their most widely read story of the entire year. I mean, part of it probably has to do with like the Tulane, very Jewish clientele. It's also a lot of Jewish women here. But also it ended up on the front page of Reddit. I didn't know what Reddit was, but apparently that was a big deal. And then it got, it was in like the Jerusalem Post, JTA, Times of Israel. I don't know. I got interviewed a bunch of different places, which was so interesting. And then in terms of the academic circles, it's not clear to me yet. Like I was just asked to go give a talk about it and my broader research on religion and education at LSU. But I don't know. I think it's too soon to tell. I think I just like checked the citation count. I think it's been cited like 5 or 6 times, but it's like a year and a half in, who knows? You know, Tulane gave me a grant to make the article open access, which I think probably allows this article to have much broader reach than it would have if it was behind a paywall, which I think will help. So yeah, I think those are probably all of my comments. Thank you again so much. I mean, over the years, I've definitely engaged with so much of the work by Paul and Harriet, and it's like fun to now be in this kind of conversation. And I'm really grateful to all of you for reading it, engaging with it, and all of you for coming and talking about it. And Judit, thank you so much for chairing again and organizing. I'm so grateful for your not just time, but also like enthusiasm and support of emerging scholars as something that we really need to do in the ASSJ. And really, I'm grateful for your support in that way.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Ilana. And as you mentioned, we welcome also Matt Bokser, who's going to be our next presenter in a session that's going to take place somewhere in March, right? This is what we are looking now. And it's also based on a very important research, a long-term research that today acquires a most relevance, I would say, that is on Zionism, right? So what it means and how he worked and what are the conclusions. So we are waiting for that. We'll define soon the date. And after this, I hope that in April, we continue with our series of presentations, of conferences. So thank you.
Can I just add one quick thing? Sorry, one thing. I forgot to add something about 2 of Harriet's comments. I'm just going to say something really quick. Harriet, the family sibling structure, yes, footnote 16, we mentioned this. We did control for that. It didn't change anything. And yes, the figure, like as you made it, is much more reflective. And I think originally we had a really messy figure. And we were also like trying to do so much in the paper that when we tried to complicate the figure, it also suggested to people that we were going to be doing this like it's kind of more psychological examination of the path analysis, blah, blah, blah. And we knew that that's not like what we wanted to put into the minds of people. So we had to simplify it and unfortunately sort of take away some of the nuance of it. And yes, I think your version is more reflective of lived reality.
Well, I agree with you with your last comment. When I had the opportunity to be a discussant when Harriet got her Sklar Award, I referred to that, the way she approaches the concept of habitus and the analytical dimension of how people and groups internalize social expectations and value systems. So in between the macro, the meso, the family had a very important role. So, well, thank you, all of you. Thank you very much. These times are so difficult and so hard that we have the privilege to think our reality, our people, our world, our disciplines, right? And this is very important. So thank you very much to all of you, and we'll see each other soon. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thanks, Judit.
Thank you, Ilana.